This is not just an old photo. It's a ticking time bomb of horror from 1871. Look at her eyes, do you see it? That's Catherine Doyle, only 9 years old, staring through the camera like she's already seen something the rest of us were never meant to. But here, the terrifying part, doctors back then, and even today, still can't explain what happened to her. And what we're about to uncover will make you question the limits of human reality itself. Boston, 1871. America was barely healing from the blood-soaked scars of the Civil War. The streets were alive with Irish immigrants fleeing famine and chasing hope. But hope had no place inside Danvers State Hospital. This wasn't a hospital, it was a fortress of shadows. Hidden deep within, children like Catherine weren't treated, they were erased from the world. Danvers was built on Salem farmland, ground already cursed by centuries of fear and hysteria. And inside its cold stone walls, doctors believed they were fighting madness. Instead, they were unleashing it. Patients endured ice-cold baths that lasted for hours, restraints that crushed the body, and so-called treatments that looked more like torture chambers. And in the middle of it all, Catherine, 9 years old, alone. The rigidity of her tiny posture, the hollow stare frozen in this photograph, it doesn't belong to a child. It belongs to something else. Something no one at the time could explain. And here's the part that will send chills down your spine. Over 150 years later, modern medicine still can't. But Catherine's story isn't just a medical mystery, it's a countdown. Every moment in her short life pulled her deeper into the nightmare halls of Danvers, a place designed not to heal, but to bury the unwanted. And what happened inside those corridors, what Catherine endured, will shatter everything you thought you knew about the human mind. And trust me, the darkest twist, we haven't even reached it yet. Inside the walls of Danvers, patients weren't treated like humans. They were restrained, silenced, and subjected to experiments so brutal they'd be considered crimes today. And it was in this nightmarish environment that a little girl named Catherine Doyle would become one of the most disturbing medical mysteries of the 19th century. Here's the chilling truth: the doctors weren't villains. They simply had no idea what they were dealing with. Their tools, crude. Their science, primitive. Their understanding of the human mind, almost non-existent. And caught in the middle of this darkness was a child whose story should have been ordinary but wasn't. Catherine was born on March 15, 1862, in the heart of Boston, the daughter of Patrick and Mary Doyle, Irish immigrants chasing the American dream. Patrick hauled heavy cargo at Boston's bustling port, while Mary scrubbed and cooked for the wealthy in Beacon Hill's elegant mansions. They lived in a cramped two-room apartment in the North End, shoulder to shoulder with other immigrant families. Life was tough, but faith and community kept them alive. For her first 7 years, Catherine was perfectly normal. Parish records, neighbors, even her teachers all described the same child: playful, curious, sweet. She made rag dolls with her mother, recited prayers in Latin at St. Leonard's Church, and sat wide-eyed as her grandmother whispered Irish folktales by firelight. She was no genius, but she was bright. No troublemaker, but full of life. She laughed, she played, she dreamed just like any little girl. Her father called her the light of our house. Her mother, she swore Catherine was her sweet girl, always eager to help in the kitchen, always worried if her father came home late. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that hinted at the storm about to rip their world apart. But in just a few short years, Catherine's bright smile would vanish, her eyes would grow hollow, and her life would become a chilling case study that still terrifies psychiatrists 150 years later. And here's the part you're not ready for. The Doyle family's nightmare hadn't even begun. For 7 years, Catherine Doyle was her parents' pride and joy, their sweet, playful little girl. But then came September 14th, 1869, a date burned into her mother's memory forever. Because on that morning, Catherine woke up different. She still looked the same curly brown hair, the same round freckled face. But inside, something had shifted. Something beyond medicine, beyond logic. Overnight, their daughter was gone, and something else had taken her place. At first, it was small. Catherine slept late, unusual for a girl who always jumped out of bed at sunrise. When she finally walked to the table, her every step felt wrong, too deliberate, too calculated. And when she sat down, she didn't say, "Good morning, Mommy. Good morning, Daddy." No, she just stared, cold, empty. And Mary would later say that in that moment, her 7-year-old daughter's face looked very, very old. Then came the voice. It was still Catherine, but twisted, rougher, deeper, as if it belonged to someone far older, someone who had lived for centuries. And that was just the beginning. Within weeks, the transformation was undeniable. Catherine began to speak with a knowledge that no 7-year-old, especially one raised in Boston's immigrant streets, could possibly have. At dinner, she casually described battles of the American Revolution, down to precise details never taught in school. She spoke of generals, strategies, even dates, as if she had been there herself. And then it got even stranger. Catherine started quoting Aristotle, Plato, ancient Greek philosophy, not like a child parroting words, but like someone who understood. She debated ideas of virtue, reason, and mortality with terrifying clarity. Her father, Patrick, finally asked, "Where did you learn this?" Catherine only smiled, a smile so chilling her parents would never forget it, and then she whispered, "I've always known these things." And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, her religious knowledge exploded. She began reciting entire passages of scripture flawlessly. Not just verses, but entire chapters. Not like a child memorizing Sunday lessons, but like a preacher possessed by something eternal. And here's the most terrifying part. This was only the beginning of Catherine Doyle's descent into one of the darkest mysteries in medical history. The biggest twist, it hadn't even arrived yet. Imagine a 7-year-old girl who suddenly starts speaking fluent Latin, not the easy church prayers, but passages so obscure that even trained priests needed books to keep up. Within seconds, Father O'Brien, the local priest, was stunned. Catherine wasn't just parroting scripture, she was debating advanced theology like a seminarian. But that was only the first crack in reality. Because soon, Catherine began revealing something far darker. She started exposing intimate secrets about people in her town, secrets no child could possibly know, affairs between neighbors, hidden debts, moral sins whispered only behind closed doors, and every time she revealed one, the room went silent. People were terrified. How could this little girl know the private lives of adults? But the nightmare was just beginning. Her obsession shifted. She began asking about death, not in the innocent, what happens when we die way of a child. No. Catherine demanded details. Graphic, technical descriptions of execution methods, medieval torture devices, and ancient diseases. She spoke casually about the Spanish Inquisition, about assassins in forgotten empires, about Egyptian mummification, with a level of precision that made even adults shiver. And then came the most chilling twist. Catherine enjoyed it. Her eyes would light up when she described suffering. Her smile, once sweet and childlike, transformed into something calculated, almost sadistic. Adults felt their stomachs turn when they saw it. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was hunger. But it got even worse. Catherine began turning that hunger inward. She started hurting herself, scratching her skin until it bled, biting her lips raw, slamming her head against walls until bruises appeared. And here's the terrifying part: she never cried. She never begged for help. Instead, she looked euphoric, like pain itself gave her pleasure. Her guardian, Mary Doyle, tried everything to stop her, but Catherine was always one step ahead. If she wasn't clawing her own flesh, she was digging nails out of the walls. If she wasn't using glass shards, she was taking utensils from the kitchen. No object was safe in her hands. And whenever Mary begged her to explain, Catherine would only smile and whisper the same cold response. Because I felt like it. But the most terrifying twist of Catherine's story hadn't even been revealed yet. Something or someone was driving Catherine. When asked why she hurt herself, her answer sent chills through her mother's veins. Something asked me too. And soon, even the animals knew it. Dogs barked uncontrollably when she passed. Cats bolted the moment she entered a room. Even birds in the sky seemed to veer away from her presence. When Mary begged for an explanation, Catherine flashed that icy, unnatural smile and whispered, "They know what I am now, Mommy. They're smarter than you." But the nightmare didn't stop at her words. It invaded her body. Catherine began to display powers no 7-year-old should even dream of. Her first display came during a violent outburst in December of 1869. In front of her horrified parents, this small girl, barely over 4 feet tall, grabbed a solid oak chair and snapped it clean in half with her bare hands. Patrick Doyle, a longshoreman who hauled massive crates daily, inspected the shattered wood himself. He was stunned. The break wasn't accidental. It was the kind of splintered destruction that required brute force, more than even he could manage without tools. And this wasn't a one-off. Days later, the kitchen table bore the proof of something terrifying. Catherine's tiny fingers had sunk into the wood itself, leaving deep impressions as if her hands had turned into iron tools. Mary tried sanding the scars away. Nothing worked. The marks remained carved proof that her daughter's body was no longer human. And her endurance, just as unnatural. One winter night at 2:00 a.m., Mary walked into the living room only to freeze in terror. Catherine was standing in the center of the room, her body rigid, her eyes locked on the wall. She hadn't moved in 6 hours. No food, no water, no twitch, just frozen in place like a statue. When Mary demanded an explanation, Catherine turned her head slowly and replied in a calm, cold voice, "I've been here since dinner." And then came the test that proved Catherine's body defied nature itself. Boston's winter of 1869 was merciless. Families wrapped themselves in layers, huddling near fires. But Catherine, she would wander outside barefoot, clad only in her thin nightgown. She walked calmly through ice, through snowdrifts, through nights that left grown men trembling. One morning, Patrick opened the back door and nearly collapsed. There in the snow-covered yard, his daughter was lying still, fast asleep. No coat, no blanket, just her gown. Her lips weren't blue. Her skin wasn't stiff. She wasn't even shivering. She was perfectly calm, perfectly warm, perfectly wrong. And yet the most terrifying transformation was still to come. The most chilling change was Catherine's strength. It wasn't her unnatural endurance. It was her eyes. Neighbors began whispering. Something was wrong with the girl's gaze. Her stare wasn't just unsettling, it was predatory. People who locked eyes with her swore they felt dizzy. Some left with splitting headaches. Others admitted they felt pure, primal fear, as though something inside her was reaching out and clawing at their soul. Mary Doyle noticed it too. Catherine's normally brown eyes began to shift. Sometimes they looked almost black like pits of endless night, and in her darkest moments, Mary swore she saw something moving inside her daughter's pupils. Shapes, shadows, something watching through her. By now, the Doyles were desperate. Their faith was their last weapon. They turned to Father Timothy O'Brien, a priest who had known Catherine since the day she was born. He had baptized her, guided her first communion. To him, she was once the sweetest child in the parish. At first, he thought the parents were overreacting, just a phase, childhood rebellion, maybe even grief twisting their perspective. But that illusion shattered the moment he sat across from Catherine. What began as a simple pastoral talk turned into a nightmare. Catherine didn't just recite scripture. She challenged it, twisting doctrine with sophisticated arguments Father O'Brien had never heard from anyone outside the Vatican's most secret halls. And then she went for the kill. With that cold, knowing smile, Catherine began reciting the priest's deepest secrets. Sins he had confessed in private, doubts about his faith he had never shared aloud, even memories from his childhood back in Ireland that no one in Boston could possibly know. Father O'Brien's face went pale. He knew this was no childish misbehavior. This was something far darker, something clawing at the very fabric of his soul. Shaken to his core, he made a decision that would change everything. He would attempt the one ritual feared by both the faithful and the damned. An exorcism. In February of 1870, inside the Doyle home, Father O'Brien prepared to face what he now believed was not just a troubled child, but something ancient wearing her skin. And what happened next would shake the entire neighborhood to its knees. It was February 1870, midnight, the Doyle home, only the family, a frail deacon. And Father O'Brien stood in the candlelit room, preparing for a battle between faith and something far darker. The exorcism began, but within seconds everything went wrong. Catherine didn't thrash, she didn't scream, she didn't fight. She laughed, a deep, echoing laugh that seemed to come from not one mouth, but many. It filled the house like a chorus of shadows. And then came the moment that froze Father O'Brien's blood. Before he could even finish his prayers, Catherine began reciting the exorcism along with him, word for word, perfect Latin. She wasn't reacting to the ritual. She was anticipating it, beating him to each line as if she knew the script of the priest's every move. By the end, the truth was undeniable. The ritual had failed. Father O'Brien, a man of unshakable faith, would later write in his diary, "It was the most terrifying experience of my priestly life." Religion had lost. The Doyles, desperate, turned to science. Enter Dr. Henry Morrison, one of Boston's most respected physicians, a man trained in Europe, obsessed with documenting the cutting edge of psychiatry. At first, Morrison dismissed the case as hysteria, maybe trauma, maybe brilliance twisted by circumstance. He believed there had to be a rational explanation. But that confidence shattered during his first sessions. For 2 straight weeks, February into March 1870, he studied Catherine with the precision of a surgeon. What he recorded still sits locked inside Boston's medical archives, pages so disturbing they read like horror fiction. Catherine's intelligence was undeniable, but it was warped. She spoke about human anatomy with a precision that rivaled medical students. She described rare diseases with terrifying accuracy, illnesses so obscure that even trained doctors struggled to identify them. And it didn't stop there. Catherine casually suggested experimental treatments that were decades ahead of her time. But the most chilling part, what she drew. Her pages weren't filled with flowers, birds, or houses like other children her age. Instead, she sketched anatomically correct skeletons, corpses in decay, human figures twisted in pain, captured with detail so vivid it made hardened men nauseous. Dr. Morrison thought he was investigating the mind of a child. Instead, he had opened a door to something that should never have existed. And the darkest revelations were still to come. Catherine wasn't just strange, she was impossible. At only 12 years old, she sketched disturbing visions with a precision no child should have. But the real terror began when she started writing in languages she had never studied. Latin, ancient Greek, even fragments of Egyptian hieroglyphs. When asked how she knew them, her answer was chilling. The words come to me when I need them. Dr. Morrison, the man assigned to study her, kept detailed notes. But what haunted him most wasn't her writing. It was her eyes. He described them as ancient, as if he wasn't looking at a child but something far older, something that was studying him instead. And then came the physical anomalies. Catherine's body temperature was always cold, yet she never shivered. Her heartbeat slow, steady, unnatural. But the most disturbing, plants withered and died if she stayed near them too long. Still, nothing prepared her family for what happened next. It was a freezing night in February 1870, 3 a.m. Patrick Doyle woke suddenly. The house was silent, too silent. The air was colder than the Boston winter should have allowed. Catherine's bed, empty. Panic set in. He searched every room, every hallway, nothing. Then, from the kitchen window, he saw it. A lone figure in the backyard. Catherine. She stood barefoot in the snow, wearing nothing but a thin cotton gown. The blizzard raged around her, yet she didn't move. She was motionless, arms stretched wide as if embracing the storm, her face tilted to the sky. Patrick's blood ran cold. He sprinted outside, expecting his daughter's body to be frozen solid. But when he reached her, what he discovered was far worse than death. Imagine finding your daughter standing in a blizzard for hours barefoot, drenched in snow, and somehow, she's perfectly fine. Patrick Doyle rushed to pull Catherine inside, but when she turned her head toward him, the nightmare truly began. Her eyes weren't just dilated, they were gone. No iris, no whites, just two voids of pitch black staring back at him. Patrick froze, paralyzed, as his little girl spoke, but her voice didn't come from her throat. It came from everywhere, vibrating through the air itself. "The stars are almost aligned, Father," she whispered, "and when they do, you'll finally understand. Catherine never existed. She was just preparation for something greater." Wait, what? That sentence shattered Patrick's world. He stumbled back, realizing his daughter, or whatever she was, might not have been his child at all. By morning, no one in the Doyle household had slept. Patrick, Mary, Father O'Brien, and Dr. Morrison argued, pleaded, and panicked for hours. But eventually, one decision rose like a death sentence. Catherine had to be sent away. The words alone nearly destroyed Patrick and Mary. She was their only daughter, but the truth was undeniable. Catherine was no longer safe, not for herself, and not for anyone around her. She was stronger than human, smarter than any scholar. Her behavior was spiraling into something no one could contain. Father O'Brien confessed his exorcism had failed. His faith had broken. Dr. Morrison admitted medicine couldn't explain her. He needed resources far beyond his own hands. The choice was brutal but clear. Catherine would be admitted to Danvers State Hospital, the most advanced asylum in New England, a place that had become legendary for its experiments in European psychiatry under Dr. Elias Hartwell. On March 15, 1870, exactly 1 year after Catherine's 8th birthday, Patrick and Mary walked her to the gates of Danvers. The hospital's looming towers rose like a fortress against the sky, a place of both hope and horror. They thought they were sending her to safety. But what they didn't know was that Danvers would become the stage for the most terrifying chapter yet. Because Catherine's story was only just beginning. March 15, 1870. Catherine Doyle, just 9 years old, was ripped from her Boston home and sent to Danvers State Hospital. But here, the chilling part, she didn't fight it. She welcomed it. The carriage wheels clattered against the frozen ground as the family's last hope vanished into the distance. Catherine sat in silence, her face pressed to the window, her expression not childlike but ancient, like she'd lived centuries before this moment. Then, without warning, she turned to Dr. Morrison, her voice calm and knowing. "You're going to try to photograph me, aren't you, doctor? Let's see what your camera can really capture." Wait, how did she know that? The journey ended at a place that looked less like a hospital and more like a cursed fortress. Danvers State Hospital loomed over the Massachusetts countryside, mile-long corridors, Gothic towers, stone walls rising like a medieval castle. A place built with the promise of curing broken minds, but in reality, it had become a prison for society's unwanted. Inside, the truth was worse than anything Patrick and Mary could have imagined. 600 patients crammed into crumbling halls, screams echoing from locked cells, chains clattering in the dark, the stench of sweat, urine, and hopelessness so strong that even disinfectant couldn't mask it. And now their daughter was here. At the helm of this institution was Dr. Elias Hartwell, a Harvard man, trained in Paris, who saw himself as a pioneer. He believed science could break into the darkest corners of the human mind. To him, Catherine was just another test subject, another fragile case of hysteria. But when she stepped into his office for her first examination, Hartwell's arrogance shattered. Because Catherine Doyle wasn't fragile. She was something else entirely. And what Hartwell saw in that first meeting would turn the entire hospital into her stage. Dr. Elias Hartwell had read Morrison's reports. To him, it was just another case of medical exaggeration, another child wrapped in superstition. But the moment Catherine walked into his office, that skepticism collapsed like glass under a hammer. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even curious. Catherine walked in with cold precision, her eyes scanning the office as though she was the one conducting the examination. And then she opened her mouth. In the very first minutes, Catherine revealed the names of 3 patients who had died inside Danvers. Not just their names, but the exact dates of death and intimate, private details of their final moments. Information locked away in files Catherine could never have seen. Hartwell froze, but before he could respond, Catherine went further. She began peeling back the darkest corners of his own life, secrets no one should know, events from his childhood, professional decisions he regretted, even whispers of his failing marriage. Shaken, Hartwell stammered, "How do you know this?" Catherine just smiled. That cold, calculated smile that had already destroyed one priest and terrified one doctor. Then she whispered, I have my ways of knowing things about interesting people. Hartwell's skepticism was dead. For now, Catherine was placed in the pediatric ward, a wing housing just 20 children. It was overseen by Sister Margaret O'Connell, a veteran nun who thought she'd seen everything in 15 years of dealing with disturbed children. She hadn't, because Catherine didn't scream, she didn't fight, she didn't lash out. No, what she did was far more terrifying. Within a single week, 3 of the most stable children in the ward, kids considered success stories, began unraveling. Not violently, not dramatically, but in a way far more sinister. It was as if Catherine had reached inside their minds and flipped a switch. And this was only the beginning. Then came the tipping point. Within days of Catherine's arrival, children who had once been stable began unraveling in ways no one could explain. They stopped playing. They stopped laughing. They stopped even responding to questions. Instead, they just sat in silence, staring at the walls as if watching something adults couldn't see. The first to break was Emma Sullivan, a 6-year-old who had been admitted after losing her parents in a horrific carriage accident. Emma began whispering about a woman in black, impossibly tall, draped in shadows, with long dark hair that moved as if it had a life of its own. But it was her eyes that froze everyone who heard her story. Emma described them as dark holes where light should be. And here's the terrifying part. Emma wasn't alone. Soon every child Catherine had touched began describing the exact same figure, the same height, the same long black hair, the same hollow eyes. Not similar, identical. At first, Sister Margaret dismissed it as childish imagination. But her confidence crumbled when the children began revealing knowledge they couldn't possibly have. They spoke of Catherine's old conversations with her parents. They described rooms inside the Doyle home in Boston they had never seen. And then came the most shocking case, Timothy Chen, a 9-year-old boy from a Chinese immigrant family who had barely spoken since his admission. Suddenly, Timothy began talking fluently about Catherine's childhood in Ireland, even telling stories of relatives who had died before she was born. How could he know that? How could any of them? The ward spiraled into something unrecognizable. The children started moving together in strange patterns down the corridors, like soldiers marching to an unseen command. At mealtimes, they arranged themselves into perfect geometric shapes, and sometimes in the dead of night, they all spoke at once, chanting in languages no one had ever taught them. Watching it unfold, Dr. Hartwell felt the walls of Danvers closing in. There was no question anymore. Catherine wasn't just another patient. She was a force, and now she was spreading. Imagine a girl so terrifying that just being near her could twist the minds of innocent children. That's exactly what Catherine was doing, and it left Dr. Hartwell with no choice but to lock her away. But here's the shocking part. Catherine wasn't violent, she wasn't screaming, and she wasn't even dangerous in the traditional sense. No, she was far worse. Somehow, she infected the minds of other children without lifting a finger, pulling them into her dark orbit like moths to a flame. So in 1870, Hartwell made a chilling decision. Catherine would be moved to the east wing of the hospital. Isolation. Her new home. A cold 3x4-meter cell, bare except for an iron bed, a wooden table, and a single barred window that barely let in the light. It was less a hospital room, more a prison. But if Hartwell thought walls and locks could contain the nightmare, he was dead wrong. Because the moment the sessions began, Catherine flipped the script. Instead of answering questions, she interrogated him. She wanted to know his fears, his secrets, his guilt. And somehow she already knew the answers. One day, Catherine dropped a bomb that nearly broke him. She described in perfect detail the drowning of Sarah Mitchell, a tragedy from Hartwell's childhood he had never spoken of to a single soul. The weather that day, the words exchanged, the crushing guilt. Catherine knew it all. Wait, HOW. This wasn't therapy anymore. This was psychological warfare. And for the first time, Hartwell realized maybe he wasn't studying Catherine. Maybe Catherine was studying him. She didn't just reveal secrets, Catherine weaponized them. Every confession, every buried fear, she twisted into a blade sharp enough to tear open the minds of those around her. And the worst part, she turned it all on the very man studying her, Dr. Hartwell himself. Within weeks, Hartwell wasn't questioning Catherine anymore. He was questioning his own sanity. His notes became frantic, his handwriting uneven, because something impossible was happening inside her room. The temperature, always colder, not just by a degree, by 6 whole degrees. No matter how high the heating roared, Catherine's cell felt like a crypt carved from ice. And then came the plants, perfectly healthy when placed on her window sill, dead within days. No sunlight, no water shortage, no disease, just lifeless, wilted husks. But the plants weren't the only casualties. Nurses assigned to her section started reporting pounding headaches, waves of nausea, and nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming. Guards swore they felt eyes burning into them, even when Catherine lay asleep. 2 of them begged to be transferred, anything to get away from that cursed room. And still Hartwell pushed forward. Summer bled into fall, and what he launched next wasn't medicine, it was obsession. He designed an experimental study program that shattered every medical protocol of the time. He tested her memory, her logic, her grasp of history and philosophy. He gave her adult-level cognitive exams meant for scholars, and Catherine crushed them. Not just passed them, dominated them. She debated like a philosopher, solved puzzles like a mathematician, and answered history questions with a precision that left Hartwell speechless. But the darkest test was yet to come. Hartwell needed to know where her impossible knowledge came from, so he escalated. Obscure documents she should have never seen, ancient texts in dead languages she had no way of reading, random photographs of strangers she could never have met. And every time, Catherine responded like she already knew, as if she had lived 1,000 lives and carried every memory. Then came the photograph that changed everything. Hartwell slid a faded image across the table, the face of a man who had died a decade earlier, in a distant city Catherine had never visited. A man no child in that hospital should have ever known existed. And what Catherine said next would shake Hartwell to his core. No hesitation. Catherine looked at the photograph of the dead stranger and spoke his full name. Not just that, she described his family, his habits, the exact cause of his death, even quirks of his personality. Hartwell's jaw hit the floor. He investigated every detail, desperate to prove her wrong. But no, everything checked out. Catherine had described a man who'd been gone for 10 years, in a city she had never set foot in. And just when Hartwell thought he'd reached the limit of impossible, Catherine unlocked a power even darker. She began predicting the future. 3 patients, 3 names, 3 deaths. She told Hartwell not only when they would die, but how. And one by one, each prediction came true exactly as she said, to the minute, to the circumstance. The staff was horrified. Hartwell was hooked. But as Catherine's powers intensified, her body began to collapse. Winter of 1870 into 1871, Catherine was changing into something unrecognizable. She was eating but wasting away. Her weight plummeted. Her skin turned ghostly pale, veins glowing blue beneath the surface like cracks in ice. Her hair darkened, thickened, almost animal-like, strands more beast than human. And then came the most terrifying symptom of all: rigidity. Hours at a time, her body locked in perfect stillness, as if carved into stone. Her chest rose and fell, her heart still beat, but her eyes, unblinking, were fixed in a stare that didn't belong to this world. Every episode synced with chaos. The room plunged in temperature, ice-cold air biting at anyone who entered. Objects shifted on their own, violently, like the walls themselves were rebelling. Staff stumbled out, dizzy, nauseous, swearing they weren't alone, that something unseen was stalking them. But the true nightmare was her voice. Rigid, frozen, but speaking no, singing in tones no human should produce. Multiple voices layered at once, rising and falling in impossible harmonies. Nurses clutched their ears, guards dropped their lanterns. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating in their bones, rattling their souls. Hartwell wrote one line in his notes that night: "This is no longer medicine. This is possession." Catherine's episodes were no longer just terrifying, they were impossible. Her body would freeze, but her mouth kept moving. Sometimes multiple voices at once. Sometimes a deep adult tone, booming from her tiny frame. And every time the words carried secrets no child should know. She spoke of wars fought centuries before her birth, details historians later confirmed were exact. She described long-dead people as if she had met them face to face. And worst of all, she predicted the future with terrifying precision. Politicians' deaths, natural disasters down to the day and place, even the private lives of staff members. Catherine would whisper a nurse's hidden affair or predict a guard's family tragedy, and within days it would come true, every single time. By spring of 1871, Hartwell was no longer studying a patient. He was staring into the abyss. And then he made the boldest decision of his career. He would photograph Catherine. It wasn't just curiosity. Hartwell had noticed something horrifying. Catherine didn't look the same to everyone. To some staff, she was just a pale, thin little girl. Nothing more. But others swore they saw something monstrous in her features, a shifting quality, subtle but deeply unsettling, like staring at an ancient being wearing a child's skin. Hartwell himself wasn't spared. Some days she looked like a frail 9-year-old. Other days, especially during her frozen, statue-like trances, he felt as if he were staring at something immortal, something older than time itself. If Catherine was a window into another world, maybe a camera could finally reveal what the human eye couldn't. Hartwell believed a photograph would capture her true essence, strip away the illusions, and record the unshakable proof no one could deny. But he had no idea that pressing the shutter would unleash the most disturbing evidence in the history of psychiatry. This was it, the moment of truth. After 15 months of unexplainable horrors, Dr. Hartwell was ready to test the unthinkable. Could a camera capture what human eyes could not? He brought in James Thornton, one of Boston's most skilled medical photographers. Thornton wasn't easily rattled. He had documented hundreds of psychiatric patients, men and women at their breaking points. But Catherine was no ordinary subject. This session would push him into territory darker than science had ever dared to go. The date was set, June 15, 1871, a Thursday morning. Hartwell knew Catherine was always eerily calm at this hour, and he needed her calm. because this wasn't just another portrait, this was a race against the unknown. At exactly 9 a.m., Thornton hauled in his arsenal a massive camera, glass plates, heavy tripod, and a traveling lab of chemicals. He had captured madness before, but the second he stepped into Catherine's room, he froze. Something was wrong. The light, it wasn't natural. The sun filtered through the barred window, but around Catherine it bent. It dimmed, as if her very presence was swallowing it whole. A strange twilight clung to her chair like a shadow that refused to let go. She sat perfectly still in her gray cotton hospital dress, watching Thornton with those ancient, unblinking eyes. But this wasn't the curiosity of a child. No. She looked at him like she had seen cameras before, like she had seen centuries before. Every click, every adjustment, every shuffle of equipment, Catherine followed it with laser precision, yet never moved a muscle. Thornton felt the seconds dragging, the tension tightening with every crank of the tripod. For half an hour she didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't speak. And then it hit him. Catherine wasn't waiting for him to take her picture. She was preparing for it. Hartwell, watching from the corner of the room, felt his heart pound. The clock was ticking. In just moments, they were about to discover if a simple photograph could expose the most disturbing secret in the history of psychiatry. But neither man was prepared for what that camera would reveal. The camera clicked, but what happened in that instant nearly broke a man's mind. Thornton wasn't just photographing Catherine, he felt like something else was photographing him. The second her eyes locked onto the lens, the temperature in the room nosedived. His breath turned to frost. And then bam! A force he couldn't see slammed through his body, making him shiver like death itself had just brushed past. For 15 agonizing seconds the shutter stayed open. 15 seconds, too long. Every tick felt like a countdown to something catastrophic. Thornton swore Catherine wasn't the subject anymore. No, he felt watched, studied, dissected, as though the lens had flipped and she was capturing him. When the shutter snapped shut, relief should have come. But instead, the real nightmare began. Thornton rushed the glass plate into his darkroom. He'd done this 1,000 times. He knew every drip, every swirl of chemical. But this time the chemicals rebelled. They hissed, warped, and twisted into patterns that should not exist. The glass seemed alive, like it was fighting him. And then the image began to emerge. At first it looked normal. Catherine, sitting in the chair, same clothes, same room, perfectly still. But then no. Thornton froze. Dr. Hartwell stopped breathing. The photo wasn't just Catherine. Parts of her face were sharp, too sharp. Other parts blurred, smeared, like something was moving inside her skin. Around her body, faint outlines, shadows that didn't belong clung like parasites. Some areas of the plate developed instantly bright, while others stayed black, as if light itself refused to reveal them. Thornton, a man who had seen everything the world of photography could offer, whispered one chilling line. "This is impossible." But here's the catch. This was only the first photograph. What they saw next would make this moment look like child's play. High voltage, biggest twist hasn't even dropped yet. When the photograph finally dried, the room went silent. Everyone expected a strange image, but no one was ready for this. Catherine's eyes, frozen on the glass, weren't just looking at her audience. They were hunting them. No matter where you stood, her gaze followed. From the left, from the right, even upside down, the eyes locked onto yours. And worse, they weren't flat. They had depth. Endless, bottomless depth. As if the photo had punched a hole through reality and captured layers of infinity inside her pupils. Doctors whispered that if you stared too long, you felt like you were falling in. Some swore they saw movement, something alive, inside those black wells. But that wasn't the only horror. Catherine's face wasn't quite right. It was her expression, but not. Like a version of her slightly out of phase with reality, a mask lifted for only the camera to see. And then came the shadows. Around her body, faint, shifting figures hovered in places no light source could explain. They weren't still. They slithered at the photo's edges like other presences had snuck into the frame. Thornton and Dr. Hartwell stared for minutes, frozen. They weren't just looking at Catherine anymore. They were looking at something else. The photograph spread like wildfire through Danvers Hospital. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a problem. An infection of curiosity. Within days, Dr. Hartwell convened a secret meeting. The hospital's most elite minds crowded into a single room, passing the photo from hand to trembling hand. Dr. William Foster, the second most respected physician in the entire institution, broke the silence first. His voice was steady, logical. "This is nothing but a technical defect," he insisted. "Chemicals, bad lighting, a malfunction." But the room wasn't convinced. And when Thornton returned to prove it, loading the same camera, the same chemicals, the same room, even the same chair, the truth snapped into focus. The control photographs were flawless. Normal, perfect. No shadows, no infinite eyes, nothing. Which meant Catherine's photo wasn't a mistake, it was unique. The tension hit like a thunderclap. Every explanation shattered. That's when Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few women in psychiatry at the time, broke through with a chilling theory. "What if this isn't a defect of the camera," she said, "but of Catherine herself?" And the room went dead silent, because if she was right, it meant Catherine wasn't just sick. She was broadcasting something impossible. High voltage, but the darkest revelation hadn't even surfaced yet. What they discovered next would make this moment look like child's play. Dr. Sinclair's words hit the room like a lightning strike. What if Catherine's condition wasn't just in her mind, but in her environment? She wasn't talking about hallucinations anymore. She was talking about Catherine physically bending reality. Sinclair recalled bizarre European reports, patients in psychotic states who moved objects without touching them, furniture sliding, candles snuffing out, clocks stopping. And when the staff looked back at everything Catherine had done, objects shifting across the room, sudden drops in temperature, plants dying in her presence, it all fit. Sinclair suggested Catherine's brain might be producing bioelectric fields so powerful they distorted the world around her. Hartwell, though shaken, refused to dive headfirst into the paranormal. If this was real, he wanted proof. Hard data. Controlled experiments. He ordered the hospital to measure temperature, magnetic fields, even attempt experimental photography that could capture invisible energy. Catherine wouldn't just be observed anymore. She'd be tested like a living mystery. But the photograph, the one that started it all, would not stay contained. Copies were smuggled out, landing in the hands of America's top doctors and even European pioneers of psychiatry. And every single response was the same: disturbance. Not one specialist had ever seen photographic anomalies like this. Then came the most haunting letter of all, written by Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German psychiatrist who dominated the field of hysteria and dissociation. His conclusion was chilling. Catherine might not just have multiple personalities. Her different selves could actually rewrite her physical body, captured by the camera but invisible to the naked eye. And then June 1871, the tipping point. Whatever happened in that photography session, It triggered something catastrophic. Catherine's decline was no longer gradual, it was a freefall. She began locking into states of terrifying catatonia. What once lasted hours now stretched into days. She didn't move. She didn't eat. She didn't blink. But she was awake. Her eyes stayed open, always watching, following every movement in the room. It was like she was frozen, but still fully aware. High voltage, and what she did during those frozen states, would shatter even the last illusions of science holding Danvers Hospital together. Imagine a child so still, so frozen, you'd think she was a corpse, except her eyes were wide open, locked on you, following your every move. That was Catherine Doyle in her final months, and what happened inside her room was pure chaos. The catatonia that once lasted hours now stretched into weeks, and every time her body froze, the phenomena around her exploded. Her room would plunge into sub-zero temperatures, ice forming across the windows, while the rest of the hospital sweltered in summer heat. Objects didn't just move. They rocketed across the room like invisible hands were hurling them, smashing into walls and splintering furniture. Doctors, nurses, even priests reported the same horrifying experiences. Whispers in languages no human could identify, shadows darting at the edge of vision, nausea so violent it knocked staff to their knees. Sister Margaret O'Connell, the bravest soul in the hospital, finally broke. In her transfer request she wrote, "Whatever is happening to her is spreading. I fear for all our safety." But Catherine wasn't just tearing the world around her apart. She was being destroyed too. Her body wasted away until she looked skeletal, her skin so translucent you could trace every vein. Her once light hair turned pitch black, growing rapidly to unnatural lengths as if some other force was rewriting her biology. And then September 1871. Catherine entered her final catatonic state, 6 weeks of stillness. No food, no water, no words. By every law of medicine she should have been dead in days. Yet somehow, impossibly, she kept living. Her chest rising and falling, her eyes tracking those who dared step inside, sometimes her lips twitching as though whispering to someone invisible standing right beside her. Finally, on November 2nd, 1871, Catherine Doyle's story ended. She didn't convulse. She didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes during one of the rare moments when her room was silent and her breathing stopped forever. At that exact second, the impossible grip on her room snapped. The ice melted, the shadows vanished, and the temperature returned to normal for the first time in months. Dr. Hartwell stood in stunned silence, realizing the truth. Catherine Doyle had not just been a patient, she had been a portal. High voltage, and when that portal closed, the world may never know what went back with her. Catherine's death should have ended the nightmare, but instead, it detonated a mystery so terrifying it would haunt science for decades. The moment Dr. Hartwell cut into her body, the first shock dropped. Her organs were flawless. No disease, no decay, no explanation for why she was dead. But then came the impossible, her brain. Parts of it looked like they belonged to a genius centuries ahead of her time, while other sections were frozen, underdeveloped like a child. It was as if Catherine wasn't one person, but two, trapped in the same skull. And the horror didn't stop there. Days passed, weeks passed. Yet Catherine's body refused to rot. No chemicals, no preservation, just lying there untouched by time. It was like death itself had skipped her. When she was finally buried in the hospital's cemetery, nature revolted. Grass and flowers refused to grow on her grave. The soil turned barren. The air above her tomb dropped colder than the rest of the cemetery. Visitors whispered of chills, whispers, and a crushing sense of dread when they passed her resting place. Catherine was gone, but something still lingered. Hartwell became obsessed. He spent the rest of his life documenting the unexplainable. His journals didn't solve the mystery, they fueled it. Soon, his writings became essential reading across Europe and America, not because they offered answers, but because they shattered every medical certainty of the 19th century. And then came the photograph. Catherine's portrait spread like wildfire, copied and mailed across universities and institutions. Experts tore it apart, desperate for an explanation. Some blamed the camera, others called it an optical glitch. But every single person who stared too long reported the same thing, an unshakable psychological effect, like Catherine was staring back. Decades rolled by. Catherine's name should have faded into dust, but it didn't. Researchers still journeyed into Danvers' haunted archives, desperate to make sense of Hartwell's chilling reports. The deeper they read, the stranger it got. And then, in 1923, over 50 years after Catherine's death, something happened that would blow the case wide open. Wait until you hear what they found. In 1923, over half a century after Catherine's death, the case finally caught the eye of one of the most legendary psychologists in history, Carl Jung. And when Jung stared into her photograph, he didn't just see a patient, he saw a gateway. Jung proposed that Catherine might have been the ultimate example of synchronicity, a living nexus where separate realities collided, where events with no causal link somehow intertwined. He believed Catherine was a human fault line, a place where the psychic world cracked open into the physical. But the deeper scientists looked, the stranger it got. With modern tools, researchers began tearing into her files, searching for answers the 19th century could never have imagined. One theory: Catherine may have been suffering from a terrifyingly rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy, a kind that hijacks memory, language, and time itself. This could explain her impossible knowledge through something called cryptomnesia, the ability to pull memories buried so deep they feel supernatural. But then came Dr. Sarah Chen of Harvard. Her conclusion was even more unnerving. She argued Catherine's brain might have allowed her to unconsciously process everything: micro-expressions, smells, the tiniest environmental cues, at a level so extreme it gave her the illusion of psychic powers. In other words, Catherine wasn't guessing. She was calculating reality faster than anyone alive. Others pushed the savant theory. Maybe Catherine's mind fractured into multiple personalities, each one carrying different skills, languages, and knowledge. One girl, infinite minds. It would explain her impossible talents, but it still didn't explain the physical horrors. Because even the smartest theories crash into the same brick wall. Her body's refusal to decay, the bone-chilling temperature drop around her grave, objects moving without cause, and photographs that warped under her presence. Some researchers whispered she might have been a bioelectric anomaly, a human lightning rod, generating fields so intense they bent reality. Others claimed she was simply a highly sensitive person pushed to an unimaginable extreme. But none of it can fully explain Catherine Doyle. A century later, her shadow still hangs over science like an unanswered scream. And the most chilling part, every expert agrees on one thing. If Catherine really was the convergence point of realities, then somewhere, somehow, another one could be walking among us right now. What if I told you a 9-year-old girl left behind a mystery so terrifying that even 150 years later, science still can't explain it? Some experts believe Catherine Doyle's body could generate electromagnetic fields strong enough to warp cameras, freeze rooms, and even twist reality itself. But here's the twist. Her story didn't just haunt medicine, it rewrote it. Catherine became one of the most documented and debated medical enigmas in history, fueling generations of researchers and sparking countless investigations into the darkest limits of human experience. And the reason we even know her story, one man, Dr. Hartwell, his obsessive records became the blueprint for studying the impossible. His work was so meticulous that even today, modern researchers are still using his methods to chase mysteries that defy explanation. Without him, Catherine's name might have disappeared. Instead, she became the case that broke science. More than 150 years after her death, Catherine Doyle is still unsolved. Her story sits at the razor's edge between medicine, psychology, and something beyond human comprehension. Every theory crumbles under the weight of her case. Temporal lobe epilepsy doesn't explain the photographs. Dissociation doesn't explain the temperature drops. Savant syndrome doesn't explain why her eyes in a single image could terrify trained doctors into silence. And that's the real kicker. Look at her photograph today and you'll see what they saw. Eyes far too ancient for a child. An expression carrying knowledge no 9-year-old should ever possess. A face that feels wrong, as if it's hiding a truth too heavy for the living. Scientists keep trying to explain it, but every modern theory stops short. Nothing ties it all together, which forces us into a darker possibility. Maybe our entire understanding of the human mind, of physics itself, isn't big enough to contain Catherine Doyle's story. Because Catherine didn't just die in 1871. She's still here, in the archives, in that cursed photograph, in every unsolved phenomenon that science refuses to admit. Her case is a reminder, a warning that human experience is far more terrifying and mysterious than our models can handle. And the scariest part, Catherine Doyle was only 9 years old, and if she existed once, what's stopping another? Catherine Doyle's story doesn't just invite us to question reality, it dares us to. Her case reminds us that the strangest experiences aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're simply beyond what science can handle. Dr. Hartwell's greatest achievement wasn't solving her mystery, it was preserving it. He and his team refused to jump to conclusions. Instead, they documented everything. And because of that, Catherine's photograph still stands as one of the most chilling pieces of medical evidence ever captured. A single frozen moment that continues to taunt science with questions it cannot answer. Look into those eyes today, and you're staring into a century-old paradox. A child who lived only 9 years, yet left behind a legacy that has haunted medicine, psychology, and history for more than 150. Catherine's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The world is still filled with mysteries, and sometimes the question is more terrifying than the answer. And here's the crazy part, Catherine's case isn't alone. Hidden in archives across the world are dozens of stories just like this. Patients who defied medicine, photographs that captured things no camera should, mysteries so disturbing, entire fields of science tried and failed to bury them. If Catherine's story shook you, then you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we dig up the darkest, most forbidden cases in medical history. Because the next photograph we uncover might change everything you thought you knew about the human mind. Until the next macabre story.